Why did an ancient maritime tradition consider the presence of women on board a harbinger of disaster? This belief, which spanned centuries and oceans, shaped not only the makeup of ship crews, but also gave rise to some of the most extraordinary tales in global seafaring history. Stories of women who defied convention, circumvented laws, and created legends that still echo in the most remote ports of the world. Imagine for a moment, you're standing in an 18th century English port, watching dozens of men board a galleon, setting sail for a months-long journey across turbulent seas. Among them, someone harbors a secret that could change the fate of the voyage entirely. But what is this secret? And why would its revelation cause such an uproar among superstitious sailors? The answer lies in a tradition that dates back to the dawn of navigation, the belief that women on board brought bad luck. But where did such deeply rooted superstition originate? Some historians trace it to ancient Mediterranean civilizations, where ships were consecrated to male deities. Others argue that it stemmed from the practicalities of maritime life, tight quarters, long voyages, and the tensions that a woman's presence could ignite among an all-male crew. Yet there is a more intriguing theory. What if this superstition wasn't just about bad luck, but about power? After all, in many ancient cultures, women were associated with dominion over the sea. Think of sirens, water nymphs, and goddesses of the ocean. Could the prohibition have been a way to keep feminine power away from ships? Regardless of its origin, this belief created an overwhelmingly male world at sea. But here lies the first great irony of this story. The more women were forbidden from sailing, the more they found creative ways to do so. And some of these methods were so audacious they challenge our very notion of courage and determination. Take the case of Mary Read, an Englishwoman from the early 18th century. Born illegitimate, she was raised by her mother as a boy to secure a family inheritance. But here's the fascinating detail. When Mary grew up and could have revealed her true identity, she chose to continue living as a man. Why? The answer takes us on a journey through the Caribbean, where she would become one of the most feared pirates of her era. Mary was not alone in this choice. Anne Bonny, another legendary pirate, also abandoned conventional womanhood to embrace the freedom of the sea. But what's most intriguing is how these women managed to maintain their disguises in such intimate environments as pirate ships. How was it possible to conceal a female identity in cramped quarters where sailors shared hammocks and had no privacy for basic needs? The answer reveals much about maritime life at the time. First, personal hygiene was poor for everyone. Bathing was rare and clothing was worn for weeks on end. Second, many sailors were young and beardless, blurring physical distinctions. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was an unspoken code not to ask too many personal questions about a shipmate's past. But not all women at sea sailed in disguise. Some received official permission, usually as wives of captains or officers. These women had a vastly different experience. They were accepted but also isolated, respected yet feared, protected but constantly scrutinized. What kind of life was that? What did it feel like to be the only woman among dozens or hundreds of men? Some of their diaries have survived, revealing fascinating insights. Elizabeth Simcoe, the wife of a colonial governor, described her 1791 sea voyages with a mix of fascination and fear. She noted how sailors' behavior shifted in her presence. Some became overly respectful, others clearly resentful, and some viewed her as an almost mystical figure. Here we find another compelling layer of this history. Women who were legally allowed aboard often became figures of informal power. They were consulted on decisions, acted as mediators in disputes, and in some cases took real command when their husbands were incapacitated. It was as if the rarity of their presence endowed them with special authority. But perhaps the most extraordinary case is that of Grace O'Malley, the legendary 16th century Irish leader. This was not a woman who disguised herself or sailed by permission. This was someone who commanded her own fleet. How did a woman in such a restrictive era become one of the most powerful naval figures of her time? Grace, known in Gaelic as Grain Mahaol, was born into a family of sailors and traders. From childhood, she joined her father on voyages, learning navigation, trade, and when necessary, naval combat. But what transformed her from a spirited youth into a legend was her refusal to accept the limitations imposed on women of her era. When her first husband died, Grace didn't retreat into the quiet life of a respectable widow. Instead, she took command of the family's ships and expanded operations. When English authorities tried to halt her trading activities, she essentially became a legitimized pirate, attacking enemy vessels and defending Irish interests. Most impressively, Grace managed to maintain her authority not only over her own men, but also earned the respect of other naval leaders, and even of Queen Elizabeth I herself. How was this possible? How did a 16th century woman negotiate as an equal with the most powerful monarch in Europe? The answer leads us to a deeper understanding of feminine power at sea. When a woman managed to establish her maritime authority, she was often more respected than her male counterparts. Perhaps because her very presence was seen as proof of exceptional ability. After all, if a woman could survive and thrive in such a hostile environment, she must possess extraordinary qualities. This perception gave rise to some of the most enduring maritime legends. In China, Shi Yangliang commanded a pirate confederation in the 19th century that grew to over 80,000 members. Her power was so absolute that she negotiated directly with the Imperial Chinese government, eventually securing amnesty for her followers and an official naval post for herself. But how could a woman maintain discipline over thousands of pirate men? The codes that Shi Yangliang established for her fleet reveal a sophisticated understanding of maritime psychology. She created strict rules regarding the treatment of captured women, established internal justice systems, and most importantly, demonstrated that her leadership resulted in greater profits for everyone. Here we find an interesting pattern. The women who managed to take command at sea often did so through a combination of exceptional competence and intuitive understanding of group dynamics. They didn't try to imitate male leaders, but developed unique leadership styles that seemed particularly effective in the maritime environment. This leads us to a provocative question. Are women naturally better naval leaders? Some historians argue yes, pointing to traits such as greater tolerance for calculated risk, better mediation skills, and a more holistic approach to problems. Others disagree, suggesting that only exceptionally skilled women were able to reach leadership positions, thus creating a biased sample. Regardless of the answer, it is undeniable that the women who sailed, disguised, authorized, or commanding developed survival strategies that deserve our admiration. Consider the psychological challenge, living in constant alertness, always aware that a wrong word, a revealing gesture, or an unforeseen situation could expose their identity and put their life at risk. The accounts of Mary Read and Anne Bonny, for instance, suggest they developed such convincing male personas that some of their pirate companions were genuinely surprised when their identities were revealed during trial. How does one build such a consistent false identity? What kind of mental strength does it take? The evidence suggests these women didn't merely adopt male mannerisms, they fully internalized their roles. They spoke like men, fought like men, drank like men, and in many cases developed romantic relationships as men. It was an almost total psychological transformation. But here arises an even more intriguing question. What happened when these women were discovered? Contrary to what we might expect, the revelation often didn't lead to immediate rejection. In some cases, the crew already suspected and had tacitly agreed to keep the secret. In others, the competence demonstrated by the woman was considered more important than her gender. There is a documented case from 1780 of a woman named Hannah Snell, who served in the British Royal Navy for several years before being discovered. When her identity was revealed, instead of being punished, she was awarded a military pension and became a popular celebrity. Why such a different reaction than what maritime superstitions would suggest? The answer may lie in the difference between superstition and practical reality. While traditional beliefs claimed women brought bad luck, real-world experience showed that competent women contributed just as much as any male crew member. This tension between belief and evidence created some of the most interesting dynamics of maritime life. Also consider the women who sailed openly but in traditionally feminine roles. Nurses, cooks, laundresses, these women were technically accepted on board, but lived precarious lives. They provided essential services, but were often seen as objects of temptation or potential sources of conflict. Naval regulations of the time reveal the anxiety caused by the female presence. Detailed rules governed when and where these women could be, whom they could speak to, and what clothes they had to wear. It was as if their very femininity was considered a dangerous force that needed to be constantly controlled. But some of these women found ways to turn those restrictions into opportunities. Elizabeth Bowden, who worked as a nurse on Royal Navy ships in the 18th century, left detailed memoirs of how she used her position to gather information, influence decisions, and even interfere in punishments she considered unfair. She had discovered that being underestimated could be a strategic advantage. This brings us to a frequently overlooked aspect of this history: the networks of female support that developed in ports. Sailors' wives, taverns run by women, brothels, boarding houses. There existed an entire female ecosystem that sustained male maritime life. And within this ecosystem, information circulated, plans were made, and occasionally new sea adventures were plotted. Many of the women who eventually sailed began their journeys in these port environments. They heard stories, made connections, and gradually developed the knowledge and courage needed for their own adventures. It was almost like an informal university of female navigation. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is how it influenced the evolution of maritime superstitions themselves. As more cases of successful female sailors became known, traditional beliefs began to shift. Some cultures developed the notion that certain women, especially those with special skills or particular lineages, could not only sail without bringing bad luck, but actually protect the ships. In French Brittany, for example, the tradition of the maritime developed. Women considered blessed by the sea spirits, whose presence aboard was seen as protection against storms. How did a superstition that originally excluded all women evolve to revere some of them? The answer may lie in the adaptive nature of human beliefs. When reality consistently contradicts a belief, the belief is either abandoned or it evolves to accommodate the new evidence. In the case of women on ships, the second option prevailed, creating a more nuanced belief system that acknowledged both the power and the potential danger of the female presence at sea. This evolution had significant, practical consequences. In the 19th century, some maritime companies began to hire women specifically for their supposed special abilities. Nurses who were considered blessed, cooks rumored to bring good luck, even navigators who claimed to have prophetic visions about weather conditions. Some of these women were genuinely skilled in their professions. Others were adept at exploiting superstitions in their favor. The distinction was not always clear, and perhaps it wasn't important. What mattered was that they had found a way to turn centuries of exclusion into opportunity. This brings us to a final reflection on the legacy of these extraordinary women. Their stories are not just tales of adventure. They are examples of how determined individuals can challenge and eventually transform seemingly immutable systems. Every woman who sailed in disguise, everyone who commanded her own vessel, every one who served openly despite superstitions, contributed to a slow but irreversible shift in maritime culture. Today, when we see women commanding merchant ships, serving in naval forces, and exploring the oceans as scientists and adventurers, we can draw a direct line back to those pioneers who risked everything to set sail. They did not just challenge conventions, they revealed those conventions to be fundamentally arbitrary. But perhaps the most important lesson from their stories is about the nature of the sea itself. The oceans do not distinguish between men and women. They test equally the courage, skill, and determination of all who dare to navigate them. The women who managed to prove this, whether through disguise, defiance, or diplomacy, not only earned their right to sail, but secured their place in maritime history forever. And so, the next time you look out at the ocean horizon, remember this: beneath those waters lie not only the dreams and ambitions of generations of sailors, but also the secrets, the struggles, and the triumphs of women who refused to let ancient traditions define the limits of their lives. Their stories continue to echo in every breaking wave, every blowing wind, every port where ships arrive and depart. Eternal reminders that the true spirit of the sea knows no gender boundaries.